Welcome to our 6th Organization of Biological Field Stations Live from the Field event. My name is Kerry Wininger with Sonoma State University's Center for Environmental Inquiry. We encourage you to take a look at the other 2 events we have coming up this spring on carbon storage and cycling and impacts of field research on society, and to view past recordings. You can learn more at thevirtualfield.org. For those of you who are instructors, be sure to visit thevirtualfield.org to access supplementary materials for your students, such as an instructor guide for live from the field events with suggested assignments, and an event resources document full of publications about the specific research topics and projects being considered today. So very quickly, here are some guidelines for this webinar. Remember, all participants are muted and your video cameras are off. During the presentation, please use the chat button to communicate with us and each other, and remember to choose all panelists and attendees so that everyone will see your comments. During the presentations and the live Q&A session with researchers, please submit your questions using the Q&A button, not the chat. If you're here as part of a college class, please type the word student in front of your question so we can prioritize it. And it's important to make sure your full name is visible either as your Zoom username or typed in after the word student so you receive credit for attending today. Also, welcome if you're watching us streaming live on Facebook. We will try to get to your questions too. Without further ado, I will turn this over to Dr. John Wenzel, Director of Powdermill Nature Reserve with the Carnegie Museum of Natural History and Adjunct Professor at Ohio State University. John was a professor at Ohio State for 17 years, where he studied evolution of insects, and then moved to Powdermill a decade ago, where he began working with remote sensing and mostly focuses on forest ecology. He has worked at field stations in 14 different nations over the last 43 years, and we're very fortunate to have him moderating this event today. John, we can't hear you.
Okay,
Thanks.
how about that? Sorry about that.
Sounds good.
Thank you all for joining live from the field. We welcome classes, faculty, and other participants from across the nation and around the world. Welcome, everyone. This is the 6th Live from the Field event. In this series, we take you on virtual field trips to research sites around the country and around the world. As you'll see today, we're visiting 3 biological field stations, places where people from many backgrounds come together to study the environment. Live from the Field events are a project of the Virtual Field, an international coalition of over 50 field stations and marine laboratories. This is National Science Foundation funded effort to bring the field to you. Find out more about events like this and other virtual learning experiences for college students at thevirtualfield.org. Today, we'll get a glimpse of how modern technology can provide precise data and documentation of habitats not previously possible. All of the programs we will see here record or measure from a distance a great quantity of data that is later used to characterize major environmental components. This revolution is made possible by advances of 3 sorts. One is the capabilities of the sensors themselves. Another is that the sensors are now supported by affordable devices that can be deployed by researchers on ordinary budgets. And the third is analytical advances that allow us to handle all the data and perform millions upon millions of calculations in an acceptable period of time. I'm excited to moderate this session of Live from the Field and introduce you to some cutting-edge remote sensing programs in ecology. Each researcher has prepared an 8-minute video describing their use of remote sensing to study ecology on scales too large for an individual researcher to execute. After the videos, the researchers will be able to answer your questions live. I'd like to encourage everyone to post your questions in the Q&A as we go along. Students, remember to type student and your full name in front of your question. Fairfield Osborne Preserve is a 450-acre field station on Sonoma Mountain in North Bay, California. It's managed by the Center for Environmental Inquiry at Sonoma State University. who would like to acknowledge, honor, and make visible that these lands are the ancestral lands of Native people. The center mobilizes faculty, students, and community to solve complex environmental challenges, turning education into action. The researcher you'll hear from first is Matt Clark, professor in Sonoma State University's Department of Geography, Environment, and Planning, and director of the Center for Interdisciplinary Geospatial Analysis, CIGA, on campus. He's been conducting research at Fairfield Osborne Preserve for 15 years and will be talking to you today about remote sensing and conservation science. One of his favorite parts about field research is experiencing the wonder of the natural world, from the tiniest insect to ecosystem patterns across a landscape.
Hi, I'm Matt Clark, and I'm a professor at Sonoma State University. I'm in the Geography, Environment, and Planning department. And my expertise is in remote sensing, all different kinds of remote sensing, which is from drones to using satellite imagery to, in this case, using sound recorders to monitor biodiversity. We're here at the Fairfield Osborne Preserve, and we're going to show you a little bit of our recorders and our project. The Soundscapes to Landscapes project at a very high level is trying to monitor bird diversity across Sonoma County, so a county scale. We're trying to design a process that could ultimately be scaled to larger regions, multiple counties, maybe even across a state or even larger than that. The project is really, underneath it all, is run by a lot of citizen scientists or volunteers that come and help us place recorders out into areas around our county. And we get access to both public and private lands. In some cases, we actually mail recorders to landowners to put up on their property. Working with citizen scientists, particularly those that really know their bird calls and songs, we use their efforts to build a reference data set. And that's a very involved process. It's taken us over a year to do that. But then we take those data that we've collected on reference bird calls and songs, and we train a computer using machine learning technology that will go and automatically classify birds in our recordings. Up to this point, we've collected around 500,000 minutes of recordings at around 800 sites. So it's a lot of data. It's what we call a big data problem, and we really need to use machines and advanced technology to turn those sound data from the recorders into useful biodiversity data. Ultimately, what we do is we take the data from the sound recorders at different sites, and we can give you a list of species that occur at that site. And we connect those data of bird species with their location. We link that to remote sensing data, things that measure forest structure, for example, from LiDAR, phenology, the greening up and browning down of the vegetation from a multispectral satellite. We also get canopy chemistry, like the water content, lignin content of the canopy from hyperspectral sensors. And we bring all those spatial data, predictor data, together with the bird data. For each species, we map their distribution using these different kinds of spatial models. This is technology that's blending a lot of different things together: bioacoustics, remote sensing, machine learning, particularly deep learning technology, what people call artificial intelligence. We're blending all this together to create a new monitoring framework so we can track biodiversity over time. Some of the factors we're interested in tracking are climate change, how that may affect bird distributions, but also really short-term changes in the environment, such as from fire. So we're just getting our bird data from the sound recordings right now. So we haven't actually analyzed those in relationship to the remote sensing data that we're going to look at. However, we have published one paper so far where we looked at existing bird data that was already available for Sonoma County and linked it to various predictors in a spatial modeling framework. So that was kind of the prototype for what we're going to do with these new bioacoustic data. In that paper, we found that climate variables are really important for explaining the distribution of bird species in Sonoma County. And this is corroborates other findings from other studies that have looked at birds' distributions in other areas. One thing that was really unique about our paper is we brought in information on vegetation structure, so the actual physical arrangement of the branches and the leaves and trunks within, say, a forest, We brought that in using JEDI, the space-based LiDAR. And that was really unique for this kind of analysis. And we found that species that were related to conifer forests, needle leaf forests that we have around here, like redwoods, Douglas fir forests, as well as shrublands, were the kinds of species that were really well predicted with this structure data coming from the LiDAR sensor. So one of the key findings that we found so far in Soundscapes to Landscapes really has to do with the bioacoustic technology. We started off by placing smartphones in waterproof cases with a microphone attached, and they were kind of expensive and clunky to program and use. Recently, we transitioned to using audio moths, these little low-cost recorders that are very cheap, and that makes it easy for us to buy a lot of them and hand them off to our citizen scientists and access more places in a field season. So it's been really revolutionary for us. We've actually done some tests and found these audio moths have higher fidelity than our old smartphone approach. They're low cost, so there's a lot of new research being centered on using these new recorders. Another finding for us that we didn't know going into the project is that using this new modern artificial intelligence technology, deep learning, is really complicated. It takes a lot of data at the beginning where the birds' calls and songs as reference data. You need those data to both train the model and test its accuracy. And coming up with those kinds of data have been really challenging for us. It's a real limitation because these deep learning routines are data hungry. And we've been trying new ways to automate this process using citizen scientists that don't necessarily have any bird identification skills, but they can identify the birds by looking at their patterns visually when you represent sound in what we call a spectrogram, a visual representation. So we've been learning along the way how to basically build up our reference data set using citizen scientists, and then we're learning how to use deep learning. And we've been incredibly surprised and amazed by how accurate our models can be in detecting bird species. As you can see, we're really live in the field. It's starting to rain. So there was a question about whether research is a linear process, and it never has been for me. It's definitely non-linear, and you often go down one path. You have ideas of how you think your research should progress and the methods you should use, and you learn along the way. And also, at least in my field, there's always technological developments happening while you're doing the research itself, and so you can pivot and adopt new methods. In our case, we pivoted and started using audio moth recorders because we found they were much more low cost and actually better, and we can get a lot of them. So that's been huge for us. We also started with really rudimentary machine learning methods for doing bird classification in our sounds, and we moved into artificial intelligence, deep learning, because those methods were becoming more prevalent and accessible during the life of our project.
Hi, my name is Rose Snyder, and I am the project coordinator for Soundscapes to Landscapes. I work out of Point Blue Conservation Science, and I'm here to show you today how to set up an audio moth. We use the low-cost and easily programmable audio moth recorder. It's powered by 3 AA batteries that go into the back, and then there is a micro SD card on the side that stores the recordings. Has a simple on-off switch. We program the audio moth to record 1 minute out of every 10, and it stays out in the field for about 3 to 4 days, so we end up collecting somewhere around 500 minutes of recordings at each site. We put it into this nice little plastic Ziploc bag, and then we strap it to some sort of vertical structure, usually a tree, sometimes a fence post. We leave it here for 3 or 4 days, come back and pick it up, and see what kind of excellent bird sounds we've collected.
Powdermill Nature Reserve is Carnegie Museum of Natural History's Environmental Research Center, located 55 miles southeast of Pittsburgh in Rector, Pennsylvania. It encompasses 2,200 acres in the Laurel Highlands, an area of the Appalachian Mountains, which were the hunting grounds of the Lenape people. James Whitaker is a GIS research scientist who's been working at Powdermill for 6 years. He likes how field research fosters collaboration with other researchers to enhance their field research with GIS and other geospatial technologies. Today, James will tell us about his work in conservation GIS and the use of unmanned aerial vehicles, also known as UAVs, in conservation GIS.
Welcome to Powdermill Nature Reserve, the environmental research station of Carnegie Museum of Natural History. My name is James Whitaker, and I'm the GIS research scientist for the museum and Powdermill. Today, we're going to explore how we use drones to measure forest successional growth following a major disturbance, which in our case was a tornado that ripped through Powdermill back in 2012 and destroyed over 30 acres of forest. But first, let me tell you a bit more about Powdermill Nature Reserve. Powdermill is a 2,200-acre nature reserve founded in 1956 and located southeast of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We have researchers conducting long-term studies in ornithology, mammalogy, entomology, and forest ecology. The world-renowned Powdermill Avian Research Center has been continuously banding birds since 1961. We also have a GIS lab and a DNA lab on site. The reserve is open year-round to the public and offers a variety of educational programs, summer camps, and hiking. Powdermill is a typical Appalachian habitat rather than one that is unique or rare, which means it is representative of the surrounding region. Powdermill is a great place to do field research. My role is to manage the GIS lab, our spatial datasets, and to collaborate with researchers who need GIS, which is my favorite part. If you're not familiar, GIS stands for Geographic Information Systems. GIS uses maps and databases to help manage, analyze, and visualize spatial data. I started in GIS while studying zoology at Ohio Wesleyan University. I majored in zoology because I wanted to work with wildlife, but I signed up for a GIS course because I thought it would boost my studies in zoology. Like most students, I didn't know GIS existed before college, but I remember thinking, I love maps, so this course would be great. Well, I fell in love with GIS after my first course, so I took another one, then an independent study, plus a GIS internship. After all of that, I knew that someday I wanted to work with GIS professionally. So I got my master's degree in geography and then started working at Powdermill right after. This job is a perfect fit, and I consider myself very fortunate that I get to use both of my degrees. But enough about me. We need to get out into the field to collect some drone imagery of a tornado blowdown. So let's go. Before heading to the field, we first need to plan our mission and pack up the drone equipment. Using GIS, I already created an outline of the area. By importing it into the mission planning software, the flight path will be created automatically. I just need to make a few adjustments. I saved the mission plan so I can load it in the field. I check to make sure I have packed all the gear and make sure it is in working order before I leave. Ahead of time, I charged all the batteries for the drone. The drone is very expensive, so I also want to ensure the equipment is well protected. Now we're ready to head to the blowdown. Fortunately, we have an ATV to lug all this gear. The site is fairly remote, about a mile from the nearest road. All right, so here we are at one of the blowdowns. As you can see, this forest looks much different than the forest we just drove through. This is where the tornado came through. The tornado occurred on June 1st, 2012, and destroyed many trees. Right away, we mapped the areas using GPS. Since wind damage is unpredictable, we saw this as a great opportunity to study how the forest responds to wind disturbance. So we set up an experiment to salvage log half of each blowdown site. Then we built deer exclosures and control plots to measure the forest regrowth. At some sites, we also built a large deer exclosure. One of the research questions we have is, after the tornado blowdown and salvage logging, what is the difference between forest successional growth rates in deer exclosures versus outside deer exclosures? Without a drone, it is pretty much impossible to measure this growth. Okay, now we're ready to start setting up the drone so we can get a flight of the tornado blowdown area. Here we go.
We fly a DJI Phantom 4 RTK drone, which is highly accurate. First, I need to set up the mobile RTK unit. I also need to place ground control points and record their GPS coordinates. I also set out a landing pad to protect the drone on takeoffs and landings. The drone will automatically follow the flight path that we planned earlier. As it flies, it will take geocoded images that will later be stitched together using photogrammetry software to create a seamless aerial image and elevation models. The entire flight will take about 45 minutes to complete, including some battery changes. If everything goes right, it will take off, fly, and land, all by itself. Now we can head back to the GIS lab to process the data. First, we import and process the drone images using the photogrammetry software Pix4D Mapper. Photogrammetry is the science of making measurements from photographs. The software calculates measurements from the photos to create a 3D point cloud, aerial images, and elevation models that can all be used in GIS software. This animation is the primary output of the photogrammetry analysis and is actually a 3D point cloud made of millions of points, which are about 2 centimeters apart, or less than 1 inch. Next, Caitlin, a college student intern, uses ArcGIS Pro to calculate vegetation height statistics of the exclosures in unfenced areas over time. Finding the right GIS workflow and analysis is a very iterative process that requires lots of troubleshooting. We have flown the blowdowns when the vegetation is leaf on and leaf off each year since 2015, so we have data for over 5 years. With leaf on conditions, we have found that there is a clear difference between the two treatments, with inside the exclosure measuring about 1.4 times higher in average vegetation height each year compared to outside the exclosure. This means that the deer are likely impacting the vegetation growth rate.
This project is just one part of other research exploring the blowdown areas. For example, another researcher has been studying the diversity of plants inside and outside the deer exclosures. In the future, we hope to combine these studies and explore the connection between plant diversity and growth rates after a disturbance and salvage logging.
There are likely many other possible research questions to explore at these blowdown sites. Research is rarely a linear process, and we are always open to investigate other great research ideas that can take us to new heights.
Schoodic Institute at Acadia National Park is a nonprofit partner of the National Park Service and Center for Inspiring Science, Learning, and Community for a Changing World. Schoodic Institute is a 158-acre campus within Acadia's 35,332 acres on the rocky coast of Maine. Hannah Weber is the Marine Ecology Program Director at Schoodic. She's been working there for 10 years and loves that field research allows her to be outside, work with diverse collaborators, and contribute to sound management in a changing world. Here she discusses her research on the ecology of foundation species and cross-system subsidies.
Hi everyone, I'm Hannah Weber. I'm the Marine Ecology Program Director at Schoodic Institute at Acadia National Park. Schoodic Institute is a center for inspiring science, learning, and community for a changing world. And as a nonprofit partner to the National Park Service, we run the Research Learning Center here at Acadia. I have a pretty multifaceted job. There's field work as well as data work, working with partners, a lot of stakeholder work, and I also teach people how to use the tools of citizen science in their research and monitoring. I'm also a PhD candidate in the Ecology and Environmental Science program at the University of Maine. Working in the intertidal zone as a community ecologist, I work on questions around foundation species like intertidal seaweeds. I grew up in Maine and I spent a lot of time in the intertidal, quietly exploring and throwing seaweed and mud at my siblings. I still throw seaweed around, but now it's part of my research. So intertidal seaweeds around the world are harvested for a variety of purposes. In Maine, Ascophyllum nodosum makes up about 90% of the wild harvested seaweed, and Fucus vesiculosus is also harvested. These seaweed have a lot of nutrients and are processed for fertilizer and other uses. We currently have no estimate of how much of either of these species exists on the coast, and we need to be able to accurately estimate the biomass of each species for sound resource management. Additionally, published reports suggest that as the climate warms, these species may respond differently. There may be an increase in Fucus while there's a decrease in Ascophyllum. But the coast of Maine is thousands of miles long, and it would take a lot of money and people and time to measure seaweed along the entire coast by hand. So some of us wondered, can we collect field data but also collect drone data from the same places at the same time, and then use machine learning to teach and train drones to distinguish between and determine the biomass of these two common and harvested intertidal seaweeds. Again, Ascophyllum nodosum and Fucus vesiculosus. We thought it was worth finding out. The project is young, and we are collecting the data that we will use to train the drones, so I will not be sharing results or interpretation. I also want to mention that the work that I am sharing with you is work done outside Acadia National Park, as it involves drone work, which is not yet supported inside the park. So we want to figure out if we can use imaging from drone-mounted cameras to distinguish between these two seaweeds or macroalgae. The cameras can document more wavelengths of light or colors than a camera you or I might use. So we started this work last year, and here's what it looked like in the field. First, the drone work. We get to the field site, and before any of us step into the field site and muck it up, the drone operator, Stefan Clayson from Nearview LLC, launches a multispectral imaging drone. The drone flies in a back and forth pattern over our site, collecting imagery on a centimeter scale. Once that drone landed, Peter Nelson, a forest ecologist here at Scudic, or one of the undergraduates from UMaine Fort Kent working with Peter, launched the drone with a different type of sensor. We're not sure how easy it will be to distinguish one seaweed from the other, thus the two approaches. Once the drones were done flying, the field crew took the field. On the ground, that's Jessica Mullen from Maine Maritime Academy, the project PI, and a crew of Scudic technicians and other staff, as well as citizen scientists, laid out quadrats from high tide to low tide, and in each quadrat we weighed the seaweed without cutting or damaging it, and measured the depth of the seaweed bed and ID'd and counted the individuals of each of our seaweeds. We marked the location with GPS and also used a field backpack spectroradiometer at each quadrat to get close-up color signatures or spectra of each seaweed. The spectral signature of each seaweed individual is not the same. It's sort of like when we sign our signatures. Every time we sign something, our signature might be a bit different, and everyone's signature is unique. So there's a range of variability that we need to understand to be able to interpret the spectral signatures that we get in the field. Helping us with that part is Kath Mitchell at Bigelow Laboratory for Ocean Sciences. The machine learning to train drones will come in when we are able to relate what we have on the ground to what the spectral signatures are to the drone images. This project has not been without its challenges, and I'll tell you about 3 of the challenges. We started out measuring biomass using a common protocol, which is based on what is growing inside the quadrat. But when the tide goes out, the seaweed lays down and drapes over the surfaces, and this draping is what the drones record. So we need to measure the biomass of the seaweed that is draping in a particular quadrat. So this summer we will go out and put down our quadrats and cut out all of the seaweed that is draped within the quadrats and get the biomass and the relative amount of our 2 target seaweeds in that drapery. Also, the sites we originally selected were basically monocultures of ascophyllum with very little fucus. And because there was very little fucus, it's hard for us to know if we have a good handle on the fucus spectral signature. So this summer, we're going to sites that have a lot of ascophyllum and a little fucus, and vice versa, to sites that have a lot of fucus and a little ascophyllum. Finally, we found that fitting the drone flights and the on-the-ground fieldwork into one low tide was too much. There wasn't enough time, and we were racing against the tide to get all of the measurements done. So this summer we will go out on day 1 and collect drone footage, and then return on day 2 to collect field IDs, field spectra, and field biomass. This work, like so much of science, is collaborative. The challenges that we've come together as a unique team. We'd never worked together before this project, and we've troubleshot, each of us coming at the conundrum with our own areas of expertise and with the openness and willingness to ask each other the dumb questions, as this particular integration of skills and abilities is new for us all. We're all learning a lot, and we'll continue this project until we've got those drones trained and have a tool for resource managers and researchers to use. Thank you.
Now it's time for the panel discussion and the Q&A. Please post questions for the researchers using the Q&A button rather than the chat. Our college classes have a time constraint of 50 minutes, so we are initially going to give priority to their questions. After that, we'll answer questions from the other attendees until the top of the hour. As a reminder, students, please type the word student before your question and make sure your full name is visible. The panelists are going to try to keep their answers to a minute or less so we can get to as many of these questions as possible. So I have a question to start with for Matt. Caitlin Cahill asks, how many bird species have been recorded at Fairfield Osborne?
Well, a lot of bird species have been recorded so far, but we're only analyzing about 54 species right now. And we chose the species based on having unique calls that we could identify and that were fairly prevalent across the county.
Very nice. Here's a question for Hannah. Do you need a license to fly a drone?
Yes, you do. And I don't know if that's the same, James, where you are, but certainly, we need to get FAA licenses. So James, what's it like in Pennsylvania for your licensing?
Yeah, the same is true here in Pennsylvania. You need to have a license. Basically, the way we interpret the law is that anytime you're getting paid to do what you're doing, you need to have a drone license. And I think that the law is a little gray too when it comes to if you're a student doing this or not. And I would recommend too, this is a great thing for anybody. If you want to work with drones, it's a great thing to have as a certification. So if there's any question as a student, you should get this. I would recommend, finding an online course to learn what you need to learn, go and take the tests. And after you get that test done, it's pretty easy to maintain that license. So that's what I would suggest. Yeah.
I'll jump in on that a little bit too, because we've had some experience with that with students and myself getting a license to fly. And we originally started with some professors and researchers trying to study for the drone exam, and we struggled with just the books. But there's a lot of YouTube videos, as James was saying, where you just go on, and I'll put one in the chat here that's particularly good, that once I watched that video, I was ready to go. I felt really empowered to do the test. And so, yeah, and it's not very expensive. I think it was like $100 to get the test, and it allows you then to fly commercially, once you're out of school.
I'm going to ask a question to all of you really quick. Can you just remind us what actually drew you to remote sensing research in the first place? And why don't we start with Matt Clark, then James Whitaker, and then Hannah Weber?
That's a good question. I originally, as an undergrad, was a biology major, and remote sensing was really, I'm dating myself here, but it was kind of the early days, multispectral satellites. But it wasn't until I went to do a master's in forest ecology at University of Washington that I was exposed to more remote sensing and took a class, and then I fell in love with it. I always had a love for maps, and I started getting into geographic information systems, like James explained. And it was just a great way to get that synoptic overview of the landscape.
Yeah, for me, I started kind of opposite. I started in GIS first in undergrad, and then always, like I said in my video, always knew I wanted to get into that professionally eventually. So when I went back to grad school, I got my master's in geography. But then, and part of that master's program was getting into remote sensing as well. The GIS remote sensing, of course, go hand in hand pretty well. But then, when it comes to actually drone work and working in specifically in drone work, we actually had one of our neighbors who was kind of interested in kind of helping us get started. He was into drones, and we had some other people into drones. And so there's actually, so I've worked at Powdermill a total of 6 years. I worked here 3 years, took another job, and then came back. So the guy who was here between those two times, he actually started the drone program. And so when I came back, I was actually able to step right into it. But it's been a kind of really fun to get to learn how to work with the devices, how to work with the data. And so, yeah, so it's been a learning process this whole time.
Yeah, and I would say the same thing. For us, this has been project specific for us. And, like Matt mentioned, sort of there's way up there satellite data that we can use, and then there's on the ground data. But so we work in the intertidal zone, and sometimes the tide is in and sometimes the tide is out when the satellites fly over. And so sometimes we don't get the data that we need from satellites. And as I mentioned, the coast of Maine is like linearly 5,000 miles long. Believe it or not, if you run a little wheel over the whole thing, it's a huge coast. And we cannot get to the whole coast by, foot or hand or whatever. So drones are a perfect middle ground solution for us. And that's really how we came into incorporating drone work into the work that we're doing. Just super project specific for what we're doing in the intertidal right now.
Leckler has a question for Matt and the Soundscapes project. When did this project start? And have you seen a distribution change, a difference of birds, locations, or migration after the California fires in 2017?
That's a good question. It's a great question. So we started in 2017, right before we had a series of fires here. We had in Sonoma County, we had these fires in Tubbs Fire and Nuns Fire, which were kind of the initial stage of several fires that we've had since then. So we had another fire, like the Kincaid Fire in 2019, and we just recently had a Glass Fire in 2020, where before that it had been many years before there were fires in this county. So we were well poised to study this question about how fires affect bird diversity and change. We don't have those data analyzed yet, is the simple answer, but we're really excited about it. We have, fortunately, we had some sensors out in locations before they burned. And this spring, we are going out with our citizen scientists and purposely targeting areas that have burned in recent fires. And then we're going to analyze those data and see, before and after changes. So great question, TBD, hopefully we'll have some interesting results.
That's great. Yeah, what luck there. So James, we have a question for you. It looks like you're flying the drone in a very hilly, vegetated area. How do you avoid crashing the drone into the trees or the side of a hill?
Yeah, so that's a real risk that we have to take and that we have to assess. One thing that's advantageous to us because we're flying in blowdowns is that we do have areas where the vegetation has been literally mowed over. Of course, it's growing back up as we're measuring. But what's really great is if you're using a really good, so we use planning software, mission planning software for the drones. And if you're using a good mission planning software, it's going to include what we call terrain awareness. And so, so instead of just, taking the drone up from where it takes off, saying it, 100 meters or something like that, and keeping it at 100 meters from the takeoff location, we actually input some of the elevation data so that it knows to follow that elevation as it goes along the path. And so all of that is pre-calculated. You have to either the software, the planning software will have that elevation data in there, or in our case, we actually had to create our own elevation data and put it into the software. But then too, as it's coming back and landing, I'm making sure, part of the drone laws is that you need to keep a visual line of sight on the drone the whole time. So as when it's coming back, I'm making sure I'm watching every move, making sure that there aren't any branches in the way. And of course, on takeoff, I'm assessing to make sure there's no branches in the way there either. So it can be, I haven't, thank goodness, but I've heard of other people crashing drones into trees and ruining them. So it's, you don't want to do that for sure.
I would say for us, just jumping in there, for us, it's the wind. We're supposed to go out on Monday, this coming Monday. And yeah, we're not going to. We had to switch over to Tuesday because it's just going to be too windy. Again, with that planning software, we pre-plan with a lot of weather checking, and it's just, and also the ceiling height. And, if the clouds are high enough, we can still go out. If it's low wind, if the clouds come down, we can't go out. And if the wind comes up, we can't go out. So yeah, it's elevation and all that other stuff too.
I have a fun story on this topic from the field, real live thing happened. So last summer we were out, we have another project where we have a drone and we're looking at forest fuels and biomass in forests locally here. But we have this fixed wing drone. So it's not a quadcopter like James showed, but a like airplane that you just throw up and it takes off and then it lands on its belly as like a crash plate and it lands in the grass. Well, we had this very sophisticated terrain following software, and we brought in our digital elevation model that was really detailed from a laser sensor LiDAR, but we had the wrong vertical datum. So those of you who've taken GIS will know about datums. You often talk about that in a horizontal sense, but there's also a vertical one that's really important for drone flights. And we had the wrong one, and the plane came down to land, and it didn't know where the ground was. It thought the ground was higher than it really was. It ended up crashing. So it was it skidded off and then it went into a tree. So we had to get a ladder to get it out of the tree. So, it's very important. You need good software. You also need good base data and understand your GIS concepts.
Here's another question for Hannah. Does global warming look like it might be a good thing along the cold coast of Maine?
We're supposed to keep our answers to like 1 minute or less. So, right, it all depends on who you ask and what they're studying. For us, looking at intertidal seaweeds, some seaweeds like fucus are supposed to do just fine, and others like ascophyllum are supposed to retreat farther and farther north. I don't want to hedge and sort of prevaricate, but it really depends on who you're talking to. Lobster are also migrating north, and there are a lot of other species that are now sort of infilling from the south, like black sea bass and some other species that can become commercially important. So it really all depends on the species you're interested in, whether they have a huge thermal tolerance or a really limited thermal tolerance, and just what's happening also with their prey and with things that are feeding on them.
All right, this next question is for Professor Clark. Could you elaborate on what AI techniques you're using for Soundscapes to Landscapes?
Okay, again, just to keep this within a minute. Okay, yeah. So just briefly, we're using this new technology called convolutional neural networks. It's a neural network that takes your inputs. So we treat the sounds as spectrograms or images. And we use convolutional neural networks that have actually been trained on images from a vast depository from Google, like millions of images that have been labeled, where they've labeled cars and people and shoes and other things that that they're trying to use this technology to identify in images. We use that as a base layer. It's called Imagenet. There's various flavors of this now, but what we do is we treat our spectrograms as images then, or sound data as spectrograms, which are images, and we feed that into this Imagenet classifier. I mean, it's a little more detailed than that, but I got my limit. So, it's called a transfer learning, where it's been trained on a massive pile of images where there's a lot of data, and then we add in our data, which are these spectrograms, where we don't have as many representative examples of that. So, and then you get an output, which is for different bird species that are classified.
Here's another one for Matt from Tim Wilbur. Can you elaborate on how the artificial intelligence plays into your project to identify bird calls?
Well, that's the main part of it right there is, we take the sound recorders. So we have 500,000 minutes of recordings at this point. It's a lot of data. We can't look at all of those sounds and try and listen to them and identify all the birds. So we needed an automated approach. And so we've used this deep learning to do that, artificial intelligence. So again, it's we have to come up with representative bird calls to train this deep learning algorithm. And the way we do that has been pretty interesting. So we have these citizen scientists, some of which know birds really well. One citizen scientist has retired and has been into birding since he was 7. So he really knows his birds around here. So we get those people together that know their birds. They listen to a sample of the clips. They identify the birds. We get these template bird calls, and then we pass that through all of our data, and it gets hits. It's using this kind of rudimentary algorithm to do some matching. It doesn't work very well. It's very inefficient, but it gets some matches. And then we use citizen scientists that don't know their bird calls, but we can give them a template of what the bird call looks like. And they all go in this online webpage-based system to vote on if it is the bird or not the bird. It's the target. And then we do this consensus-based vote of kind of like the majority rules, whether it is a good bird call identified as the right target species or not. And that becomes a pile of reference data then that we use to do this transfer learning on the deep learning algorithm using Imagenet.
Hannah, this student wonders, do the 2 different species of seaweed serve different purposes commercially? Does the seaweed industry care if one is decreasing and the other is increasing?
Yeah, sure. Like all the rest of the questions, this is a good question. So Ascophyllum is used an awful lot as a fertilizer and as a feed supplement, whereas Fucus vesiculosus is used in nutraceuticals, it's used in cosmetics, and it definitely has a different sort of commercial profile than does Ascophyllum. So do industries care about how these different 2 species will respond to a changing climate? Yes, they do. They're paying attention to what's on the increase and what's on the decrease. One can't be sort of switched out for the other. So there is a lot of attention going on, especially in the Gulf of Maine, which is of course warming faster than 99% of the rest of the ocean. So yeah.
So for students that have to leave now, thank you for joining us. We'll be emailing follow-up information. For other attendees, the panel will stay on through the top of the hour and continue to ask your questions. Thank you for attending. Let me ask a question of everybody here briefly. How has the COVID-19 crisis affected your work? James, will you start, please?
Yeah, fortunately, it hasn't affected it too much. Certainly about a year ago, we actually went, we closed our doors, had to work from home. But because I was in the field and primarily working by myself, I was able to just pack up my gear, take it out, go into the field where I needed to, didn't really interact with anybody, and was able to continue collecting the data I needed to collect. Since things have kind of opened up a little bit more, I am able to be at my office. I'm at my office now, and things are pretty much back to normal. So fortunately, not too much of an issue on where I am at. So good thing about field research, especially when you're doing it by yourself or mostly by yourself.
Anyone else want to jump in and answer that same question?
Go ahead, Hannah.
Yeah, you go. I'll go after you.
Okay, all right. Yeah, so with Soundscapes to Landscapes, we had a little slowdown initially, just trying to get protocols in place for getting out in the field and placing our recorders, but we worked that out and we have safe protocols where we like to send people out in the field as a team, 2 people at least, for safety. So they just follow proper protocols of driving separate cars, wearing masks, staying 6 feet apart. You know, they have different tasks that they do. So we're able to do that. On the analysis side, you know, that we're doing remotely. We were already doing that remotely in kind of web-based systems and using servers in the cloud to do our processing. So that hasn't really slowed us down on the analytical side.
Yeah, and I would say last year when COVID hit, we were just bringing on our technicians and our interns, and we pushed everybody back a little bit, developed all of our COVID safe protocols and how we were going to operate in the field, you know, masks, distancing, etc. And when we were going to be safe and when we weren't going to be safe. Most of the coast of Maine is also private. And so we worked extensively with our landowners to make sure that they were comfortable with the protocols that we were in placing. And so it was just a question of implementing new protocols and practicing, you know, our tailgate safety at the beginning of every field event just always included additional protocols around COVID. I think if we had tried to start doing our field work like last March or April or May, we still would have been scrambling, but a lot of our field work was June, July, August, September. And so we had that time to sort of get our ducks in a row.
This is a quick question for Matt. This student just wants to know about the waterproof pouch that the audio moths go in and if that affects the ability to analyze sounds.
Yeah, great question. We did some initial tests without a bag and with the bag and in like a soundproof room and then also outside. And there was an effect of that bag. It's a vinyl like pencil bag. You can put it in a 3-ring binder. It's really cheap, you know, and simple. And there was an effect, but it wasn't enough for us not to put it in some kind of enclosure to protect it from the rain, because we're going out mainly in the spring when there's, not this year, but in other years there's rain. However, there is a new case that this Audio Moth group is producing now that the recorders go into and have a nice little hole that makes it waterproof. And initial results from a citizen science collaborator have shown that the quality is a lot better using these cases versus this pencil bag approach. So going forward, we're going to use that case.
Here's one for Matt. Can you tell us a little more about your background, an important experience or person who led you into this career, and what kind of things you do for your job?
Well, I talked a little bit about the the kind of traditional remote sensing, but since we're focused on remote sensing from these acoustic sensors, I'm not a birder, and bioacoustics wasn't my field. But from remote sensing, we always need ground-based data that you can then relate to your other kinds of remote sensing data. Like Hannah showed, the quadrats or going out in the field like James did. You need these data. So I saw this bioacoustics as a way to get interesting bird diversity data that we can then link back to other kinds of remote sensing. I got into that. This is a fun story. I had a field course in Argentina in 2010, where we had a bunch of students from different universities, mainly from Latin America, and we were doing this field study at different sites across northern Argentina. And one of the researchers had a iPod Touch, the old, the pre-smartphone technology, and was using it to record sounds, and has later gone on to be a real big mover in this field of bioacoustics. Mitch Ada in Puerto Rico. And so he introduced me to it, and I became fascinated. We used it with the students, and we heard all these great bird calls and other animal noises during the day and the night on that whole course, field course. So you know, you get influenced by your colleagues and what they're up to.
Here's a quick question for everybody. So I know at least Matt talked about Soundscapes to Landscapes being a citizen science project, but for all of you, what are some ways that students attending here could get involved with either your project or just in field research in general? And why don't we start with Hannah?
Sure. So, you know, as Matt mentioned, so, right, we do get out there with quadrats, and it always seems like at the beginning, whether you're putting out audio moths or whether you're, you know, laying down quadrats, at the beginning of all of this, it is many hands make light work. And I'm sure it's the same with actually looking at the soundscapes as well. So there are a lot of opportunities to just do the base groundwork, you know, switching out batteries, you know, putting out pins on the ground so that drones can read where the heck they are. And that sort of, I mean, yes, there's a lot of computer work that drones know where they are, but at the same time, so that you can go back and reference those. There are a lot of ways to get involved in, and sometimes it's volunteer work, and sometimes it's internship, and sometimes it's through coursework. But there are lots of opportunities for a lot of hands to get out in the field. So hope that helps.
Here's an anonymous question for all of you. What is some advice to a soon-to-be college graduate that wants to go into the geospatial field?
I can start off on that one. I would say that, you know, when it comes to, if you're going to be looking at certain skills to develop, I think that one of the most important skills to develop would be learning a statistical or programming language such as Python or R. My affinity is towards Python, but I do know that lots of the people I work with R. And if that's something that you already have, you know, I think it's just, you know, being able to think through projects in unique ways and think about how you can, you know, take one aspect of geospatial technology and combine it with another, or one field and using it into a different field. I find that the students who come through Powdermill, the ones that are able to have a strong just affinity towards how to bring technology together and work with it, are almost always more successful. I think one last piece too that I think is really important is being able to know how to teach yourself. You know, read the documentation of the tools you're working with, engage in the forums and communities in that way. Those are the things that kind of have been most helpful for me as I continue to do those things, you know, every day of my job. So I'll leave it to Matt and Hannah to offer some more.
Okay, no, great points, James. I don't have a whole lot more to add. I think that's great. You know, again, the online resources that are available to learn and self-improvement and learning is critical, and something that didn't exist when I was getting into GIS back in the 90s. You know, I'm so jealous now of what students have available to them. And I, like James, am constantly learning new techniques myself, you know, in bringing in new technology into my research and my teaching. So do, you know, keep moving beyond the classes you've taken, and be a self-starter kind of learner. I also agree about the programming, you know, adding programming skills to your toolkit is really important, especially when you're integrating new techniques. I'm an R person, so Python's great. I'm an R person. They're both great open source languages. Lots of resources out there, and there's a lot of great remote sensing tools, packages in both of those programming languages. So you don't even need, you know, commercial software to do a lot of stuff.
Yeah, I agree.
So that brings us up to time, and I think that we will thank all our speakers. Thank Matt Clark, James Whitaker, and Hannah Weber. We also want to thank the Organization of Biological Field Stations and the Center for Environmental Inquiry at Sonoma State University. Learn more about their series of virtual events at thevirtualfield.org and cei.sonoma.edu. Thank you to the National Science Foundation for funding this project and to all the wonderful people behind the scenes who made this possible. We'll be emailing all of you in the next few days with follow-up answers to questions we didn't address today, a link to a recording of this event, and a link to provide feedback and ideas for future events, what you enjoyed, other themes you might be interested in seeing in the future, and suggestions for how to improve. Please share the virtualfield.org and our upcoming events with fellow instructors, students, friends, and colleagues. Past event recordings are accessible on the Live from the Field page under Virtual Visits, where you'll also find links to the websites of each site featured today and event resources, including publications from each researcher and educational tools. Thank you and goodbye from the field. Panelists, please wave goodbye.